Sunlight hammers down like a physical weight upon the suffocating, dust-choked streets of Athens, Tennessee, during the incredibly tense, boiling summer of 1946. While the rest of the exhausted American Republic is actively celebrating the triumphant, hard-fought conclusion of the Second World War, this isolated, rugged Appalachian community is violently trapped under the absolute, iron-fisted dictatorship of a deeply corrupt political machine. For over a decade, a ruthless, heavily entrenched political boss named Paul Cantrell has operated McMinn County as his own highly lucrative, terrifyingly lawless personal fiefdom. Operating with absolute, unchecked impunity, Cantrell and his brutal, hand-picked sheriff, Pat Mansfield, have meticulously constructed a massive, heavily armed syndicate of violent thugs officially deputized as local law enforcement. These state-sanctioned mercenaries do not protect the public. They actively terrorize the vulnerable working-class population, aggressively extorting local businesses, brutally beating unarmed citizens in the dark alleys for the slightest whisper of dissent, and specifically targeting vulnerable returning veterans for highly lucrative, fabricated traffic fines to line the pockets of the corrupt political elite. The county jail has been actively transformed into a terrifying, blood-stained torture chamber, where heavily armed deputies violently crush any organized resistance, ensuring that Cantrell maintains absolute, unyielding control over every single municipal election through massive, blatant voter intimidation and the physical, state-sanctioned theft of ballot boxes. The incredibly arrogant political establishment has made a catastrophic, fundamentally fatal miscalculation that will permanently alter the history of the region. They are no longer dealing with terrified, isolated rural farmers who can be easily bullied into submission. They are now face-to-face with over 3,000 battle-hardened, deeply traumatized American combat veterans who have just returned home from the absolute bloodiest, most horrific theaters of global mechanized warfare. These are fiercely patriotic, highly lethal men who recently stormed the agonizing, artillery-scarred beaches of Normandy, survived the terrifying, frozen hellscape of the Battle of the Bulge, and fought in brutal, hand-to-hand combat in the suffocating jungles of the Pacific Theater. They actively bled and watched their brothers die in the mud, specifically to eradicate fascist dictatorships overseas, only to return to their beloved hometown and discover a heavily armed, deeply corrupt, tyrannical regime actively dictating their daily existence. Refusing to surrender their fundamental constitutional rights to a syndicate of corrupt local warlords, these hardened GIs spontaneously organize a powerful, highly disciplined coalition known as the GI Non-Partisan League. They actively swear a sacred, unbreakable oath to physically dismantle the Cantrell machine, setting the monumental stage for an unprecedented, heavily militarized domestic collision, where American combat veterans will be forced to utilize their terrifying wartime tactical expertise to wage a full-scale, explosive civil war directly against their own local government. Before we witness the unprecedented, heavily armed siege that is about to absolutely obliterate the political power structure of this corrupt county, you must aggressively confront the highly engineered, suffocating digital matrix that currently dictates your perception of historical reality. The incredibly wealthy architects of our modern political system desperately rely upon your absolute historical amnesia to maintain their unchecked power. They actively weaponize a highly sophisticated, invisible algorithm to keep you endlessly scrolling through meaningless, superficial digital noise, intentionally burying the terrifying reality that American combat veterans have previously organized a heavily armed, violent rebellion to physically overthrow a corrupt, rigged electoral system on domestic soil. They desperately need you totally disconnected from the profound, deeply suppressed truth that the ruling class only fears a highly organized, physically united working class, capable of aggressively defending its own liberty. You possess an incredibly dangerous, immediate obligation to violently reject this engineered digital pacification right now. We are actively forging a massive, highly educated global battalion of truth seekers who fiercely refuse to let the agonizing, blood-soaked sacrifices of these brave veterans be permanently deleted by the corporate media apparatus. Stand up immediately. Prove you are actually paying attention to the heavily suppressed chapters of history, and show the architects of this algorithmic control that we are absolutely everywhere by dropping your city and your country in the comments below to permanently map our worldwide network, and make absolutely certain they know their unquestioned dominance ends today. Tensions finally detonated into visceral, undeniable violence on the sweltering morning of August 1st, the highly anticipated election day that would decide the permanent fate of McMinn County. Paul Cantrell and Sheriff Pat Mansfield knew absolutely that they could not defeat the incredibly popular GI candidates in a fair, democratic contest. So they initiated a massive, heavily armed invasion of their own jurisdiction. Utilizing their bottomless, illicit financial war chest, the corrupt political bosses actively imported over 200 highly paid, heavily armed mercenaries and vicious street thugs from neighboring counties and out-of-state syndicates. They aggressively slapped official deputy badges onto the chests of these violent criminals, arming them with heavy blackjacks, brass knuckles, and high-caliber revolvers, and deliberately unleashed them upon the terrified civilian population. These state-sanctioned hitmen aggressively occupied every single polling station in the county, transforming local schools and quiet town halls into heavily fortified, terrifying military checkpoints, where the fundamental right to vote was actively decided at the barrel of a loaded gun. The brave GI poll watchers, who had volunteered to ensure a legally sound election, were immediately subjected to a devastating, highly coordinated campaign of extreme psychological and physical terror. The imported mercenaries brutally beat the unarmed veterans with heavy wooden clubs, violently physically threw them out of the voting precincts through shattered glass windows, and actively threatened to execute their families if they dared to report the massive, blatant voter fraud occurring right in front of their eyes. The raw, sickening reality of the corrupt syndicate's absolute ruthlessness was horrifyingly displayed when an elderly, deeply respected black farmer named Tom Gillespie bravely attempted to exercise his constitutional right to vote at the heavily guarded Athens Waterworks polling station. The heavily armed, deeply racist deputies aggressively blocked the doors, violently ordering Gillespie to immediately leave the premises. When the brave farmer refused to surrender his democratic voice, an unhinged, heavily armed enforcer named Windy Wise viciously struck Gillespie across the face with heavy brass knuckles, physically knocking the elderly man to the hard concrete floor. As Gillespie desperately attempted to flee the terrifying assault, crawling toward the exit, the corrupt deputy coldly drew his heavy service revolver and violently shot the unarmed man directly in the back, leaving him bleeding out in the dirt in a horrific, state-sanctioned execution attempt designed specifically to terrorize the entire community into absolute submission. This agonizing, undeniable display of tyrannical violence was the exact, explosive catalyst the combat veterans had been waiting for. The terrified citizens of Athens quickly realized that the local law enforcement was actively operating as a deadly, unaccountable cartel, aggressively stuffing the wooden ballot boxes with hundreds of fabricated votes while physically brutalizing anyone who dared to question their absolute authority. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the terrified Appalachian town, the corrupt deputies forcibly seized the massive, locked wooden ballot boxes at gunpoint, violently dragging them back to the heavily fortified county jail to illegally count the votes in total, impenetrable secrecy. They genuinely believed they had successfully crushed the democratic will of the people through sheer, overwhelming physical violence. But they had catastrophically misjudged the terrifying, lethal threshold of the men they were dealing with. Outraged by the blatant, blood-soaked theft of their local democracy, the highly trained combat veterans executed a devastating, instantaneous tactical shift from peaceful political candidates into a lethal, highly coordinated paramilitary assault force. Realizing with absolute, chilling clarity that the corrupt Cantrell syndicate had heavily barricaded themselves inside the thick, impenetrable brick walls of the McMinn County Jail, with the stolen ballot boxes and a massive arsenal of high-capacity weaponry, the desperate GIs knew their antique hunting rifles and standard-issue sidearms were utterly insufficient. They urgently required devastating military-grade firepower to physically breach the fortified stronghold. Moving with the terrifying, silent precision of men who had just survived the agonizing nocturnal trench raids of the European theater, a disciplined strike team of veterans aggressively marched directly upon the local National Guard armory. They did not ask for bureaucratic permission. They violently shattered the heavy iron padlocks, physically kicked down the reinforced steel doors, and systematically raided the massive state-funded weapons cache. The outraged soldiers rapidly armed themselves with dozens of heavy M1 Garand combat rifles, devastating Thompson submachine guns, and massive, heavy bandoliers packed tightly with thousands of rounds of high-caliber, armor-piercing ammunition. This was absolutely not a chaotic, disorganized civilian riot. This was a highly calculated, terrifyingly efficient military mobilization executed by fiercely patriotic American citizens who were actively preparing to wage a brutal, heavily armed siege against their own domestic government. Armed to the teeth and burning with an unstoppable, righteous fury, the veteran battalion methodically marched back through the darkened, terrified streets of Athens, systematically surrounding the massive county jail under the heavy cover of a suffocating, moonless night. Utilizing their advanced wartime tactical expertise, the combat veterans immediately established an impenetrable, heavily fortified military perimeter, aggressively cutting off every single telephone line and physically barricading all possible escape routes to ensure the corrupt political elite could not summon external state reinforcements. They strategically positioned highly trained, elite military snipers on the high brick rooftops of the surrounding local businesses, actively creating terrifying, overlapping fields of devastating, high-caliber crossfire, meticulously engineered to absolutely obliterate anything that dared to step outside the heavy iron doors of the jailhouse. The air was incredibly thick with an unbearable, explosive tension as the heavily armed veterans issued a final, uncompromising ultimatum into the darkness, loudly demanding that the corrupt deputies immediately surrender the stolen Democratic ballot boxes and walk out into the street with their hands raised. When the arrogant, deeply entrenched political bosses inside the jail responded to the veterans' demands with a defiant, mocking silence and a sudden sharp volley of hostile revolver fire, the fragile, suffocating peace of the Appalachian night was permanently, violently shattered, plunging the quiet American town directly into a catastrophic, full-scale, mechanized war zone. Erupting instantly into an absolutely deafening, apocalyptic hurricane of high-caliber crossfire, the heavily armed combat veterans aggressively unleashed the full, terrifying weight of their military fury directly against the thick brick facade of the McMinn County Jail. Thousands of heavy armor-piercing rounds from the stolen M1 Garand rifles violently shredded the wooden window frames, actively shattering the glass into a massive, lethal storm of flying shrapnel that aggressively pinned the terrified, corrupt deputies securely to the cold, concrete floor. The arrogant political mercenaries inside, who had spent the entire decade violently bullying unarmed farmers and terrorizing defenseless citizens, suddenly found themselves trapped in a horrifying, inescapable slaughterhouse, actively fighting a highly disciplined battalion of American heroes who had personally survived the absolute worst mechanized combat in human history. The veterans executed devastating, highly coordinated flanking maneuvers, utilizing the dark alleys and brick storefronts as heavy cover to aggressively pour a relentless, suffocating stream of automatic Thompson submachine gun fire directly into the besieged stronghold. Every single time a desperate, heavily armed deputy dared to blindly raise his service revolver above the shattered windowsills, the highly trained elite military snipers positioned on the surrounding rooftops instantly unleashed a terrifying, pinpoint volley of heavy lead, violently tearing chunks of solid brick directly out of the walls, inches from the corrupt mercenaries' heads. The entire town of Athens was violently transformed into a massive, heavily entrenched domestic war zone. The humid night air permanently choked with the deeply suffocating stench of burning cordite and the relentless, mechanical roar of military-grade weaponry aggressively echoing off the Appalachian Mountains. Despite the overwhelming, highly coordinated tactical superiority of the veteran forces, the massive, heavily reinforced brick architecture of the county jail stubbornly refused to shatter under the relentless barrage of small arms fire. As the brutal, deafening siege dragged agonizingly deep into the pitch-black hours of the early morning, the incredibly brilliant tactical commanders of the GI Rebellion recognized a terrifying, rapidly approaching deadline. They knew with absolute certainty that if they did not physically breach those heavy iron doors and violently extract the stolen ballot boxes before the sun breached the horizon, the deeply corrupt political establishment would actively utilize the state telephone lines to summon a massive, heavily armed intervention from the state militia, completely crushing the righteous working-class uprising under the overwhelming weight of the state government. Realizing that high-caliber rifles were utterly insufficient to break the corrupt syndicate's absolute iron grip, the battle-hardened veterans made a highly calculated, incredibly dangerous decision to dramatically escalate the domestic warfare to an unprecedented level of explosive violence. A specialized strike team of hardened combat engineers desperately sprinted through the dark, bullet-pocked streets, aggressively raiding a nearby county storage depot to secure a massive, heavily guarded cache of highly volatile, industrial-grade dynamite. They were absolutely prepared to physically blow the deeply corrupt political machine straight to hell, brick by bloody brick, to permanently secure their fundamental constitutional rights. Returning to the heavily fortified front line with massive bundles of the highly explosive ordnance, the veterans meticulously prepared for a devastating, final apocalyptic assault that would permanently break the siege. Under the heavy, suffocating cover of a massive, synchronized barrage of suppressing fire that actively forced the terrified mercenaries to violently bury their faces in the dirt floor, brave GI volunteers aggressively crawled on their bellies through the chaotic, bullet-swept street. They violently hurled the massive, crudely fused bundles of highly volatile dynamite directly onto the reinforced front porch and heavy roof of the besieged jailhouse. The ensuing detonations were absolutely catastrophic, massive, concussive fireballs that violently shook the entire foundation of the town, actively ripping the heavy steel doors entirely off their massive iron hinges and violently blowing massive, gaping holes directly through the impenetrable brick walls. The deafening, concussive shockwaves violently shattered every single remaining window in the town square, instantly plunging the deeply corrupt deputies inside into a terrifying, suffocating cloud of thick black smoke and pulverized concrete. Absolutely broken by the unimaginable, military-grade explosive terror, and actively realizing they were mere seconds away from being violently eradicated by a furious army of combat veterans, the heavily armed, arrogant mercenaries completely shattered. Desperately coughing through the thick dust and actively bleeding from the massive explosive shrapnel, the surviving hitmen frantically threw their heavy revolvers out of the shattered windows and stumbled out of the smoking, ruined building with their hands raised high in the air, physically surrendering absolute control of the county back to the fiercely patriotic American citizens they had so deeply underestimated. As the choking, pulverized concrete dust finally began to settle over the shattered, smoking ruins of the McMinn County jailhouse, a profound, incredibly heavy silence replaced the deafening mechanical roar of the furious firefight. The deeply exhausted, soot-stained combat veterans, their heavy M1 Garand rifles still radiating intense heat from the relentless, night-long barrage, aggressively marched forward into the rubble to permanently secure their incredibly hard-won victory. They deliberately bypassed the deeply humiliated, bleeding mercenaries who were frantically crawling out of the toxic debris and forcefully kicked their way through the heavily splintered remains of the iron vault doors, violently seizing the stolen wooden ballot boxes that had directly sparked this massive, heavily armed domestic revolution. In the crisp, illuminating hours of the early morning, surrounded entirely by the smoldering wreckage of the corrupt political empire they had just physically obliterated with military-grade explosives, the brave GIs meticulously counted the legally cast votes in the open air. The undeniable, heavily guarded results proved to the entire nation that the GI Non-Partisan League had won the municipal election by a massive, overwhelming, and legally indisputable landslide. They had successfully and violently amputated a deeply entrenched, terrifyingly corrupt political machine, instantly restoring constitutional democracy to their Appalachian town through the sheer, uncompromising application of overwhelming military force. The terrifying state-sanctioned thugs who had ruthlessly brutalized the vulnerable working-class population for over a decade were aggressively stripped of their unearned badges, physically loaded onto outbound commercial trains, and permanently exiled from the region under the heavy, watchful iron sights of the veteran snipers positioned on the rooftops. This incredible, blood-soaked victory remains one of the absolute most heavily suppressed, intentionally buried historical events in the entire timeline of the American Republic. The incredibly wealthy architects of your modern political reality are utterly terrified by the undeniable, explosive precedent established on the smoking dirt streets of Athens. They desperately rely upon a highly weaponized, invisible algorithmic ecosystem to keep you endlessly distracted by meaningless digital noise and fabricated partisan outrage, aggressively ensuring that you never uncover the profound, terrifying historical truth that organized, heavily armed American citizens are absolutely capable of successfully overthrowing a corrupt, rigged government on domestic soil. The establishment desperately needs you totally paralyzed, completely isolated, and entirely dependent on their highly engineered systems, completely disconnected from the massive, agonizing sacrifices made by the battle-hardened fathers who utilized stolen dynamite and military-grade combat rifles to aggressively defend their fundamental right to vote. You possess a massive, dangerous, and immediate obligation to forcefully shatter this digital pacification right now. Weaponize the heavily suppressed, explosive history of the Athens veterans to aggressively wake up the sleeping population surrounding you. We are actively forging an unbreakable, highly educated global battalion of truth-seekers who fiercely refuse to let the brutal, undeniable victories of the working class be permanently deleted by a compliant corporate media apparatus. Stand up immediately. Prove you are actively paying attention to the suppressed chapters of the past, and show the elite establishment that our movement is absolutely everywhere by dropping your city and your country in the comments below to permanently map our worldwide network. and make absolutely certain they know their unquestioned psychological control ends today.